The rain fell in sheets across the muddy expanse of Trench Gamma 7, each droplet carrying the weight of 8 centuries of spilled blood. The water pooled in shell craters and collected in the rust-eaten gutters that ran along the wooden duckboards, creating a symphony of dripping and gurgling that never ceased. Brother Matthias pulled his sodden greatcoat tighter around his shoulders as he made his way through the narrow communication trench, his boots squelching in the perpetual mire that had claimed so many souls. The walls of the trench were lined with sandbags that had long since rotted through, their contents spilling out to mix with the black earth beneath. Wooden support beams, slick with moisture and green with decay, groaned under the weight of the earthworks above. The air hung thick with the smell of wet wool, rusted metal, and something else. Something that reminded Matthias of the slaughterhouse back in his village before the calling had brought him to this endless war. He paused at an intersection where 3 trenches met, consulting the water-stained map tucked inside his coat. The parchment was barely legible, the ink having run in places to create dark blotches that looked disturbingly like bloodstains. According to his orders, he was to report to the forward position designated as St. Agatha's Rest, where the flagellant chaplain was said to be conducting evening prayers. The name meant nothing to him, but then again, most of the positions along this section of the front line had been renamed so many times that their original designations had been lost to memory. The war had consumed not just flesh and blood, but names, places, and the very concept of permanence. Everything here was temporary, waiting to be ground down by the next artillery barrage or overrun by the next wave of heretic forces. Matthias had been serving as a communications runner for 6 months now, carrying messages between the various command posts and forward positions that dotted the endless network of trenches. It was dangerous work, but it kept him moving, and movement meant survival. The men who stayed in one place too long often developed the 1,000-yard stare, that vacant expression that spoke of minds pushed beyond their breaking point. As he made his way deeper into the trench system, the quality of the construction began to deteriorate. The wooden duckboards became increasingly sparse, forcing him to step directly into the sucking mud. The sandbag walls gave way to crude earthworks held in place by sheets of corrugated metal and wooden planks salvaged from destroyed buildings. This was the realm of the forward positions, where engineers had neither the time nor the resources to maintain proper fortifications. The sound of chanting reached his ears, a low, rhythmic drone that seemed to emerge from the very earth itself. It was a sound he had heard before, during religious services in the rear areas, but there was something different about it here. The words were indistinct, muffled by the constant patter of rain and the groaning of the trench walls, but they carried a weight that made his chest feel tight. He rounded a bend in the trench and found himself facing a crude wooden sign, its paint peeling and faded. The letters were barely visible, but he could make out the words St. Agatha's Rest carved into the warped wood. Beyond the sign, the trench opened up into a wider area where sandbags had been arranged to create a makeshift chapel. The congregation was small, perhaps 20 men huddled together on rough wooden benches. They were dressed in the standard-issue greatcoats of the trench pilgrims, but their uniforms were in various states of disrepair. Some had holes torn through the fabric, others bore dark stains that could have been mud or blood. Their faces were gaunt, marked by the hollow-eyed exhaustion that came from months of frontline service. At the front of the makeshift chapel stood a man who could only be the flagellant chaplain. He was tall and lean, his frame draped in a long black robe that had been patched and repatched so many times that its original material was barely visible. His head was shaved, revealing a scalp marked by old scars, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who had spent years in the trenches. In his right hand, he held a whip unlike any Matthias had ever seen. The handle was made of some dark wood, polished smooth by countless hands, and from it hung 9 separate tails. Each tail was braided leather, but embedded within the braids were barbs of blackened metal that caught what little light filtered down into the trench. The whip dripped steadily, though, whether with rainwater or something else, Matthias could not tell. The chaplain's voice rose above the chanting of the congregation, speaking words in a dialect that sounded almost familiar, but remained just beyond comprehension. His free hand gestured as he spoke, tracing patterns in the air that seemed to leave faint traces behind, like smoke or mist that refused to dissipate. Matthias found himself drawn forward despite his better judgment. He had been raised in the faith, had attended services in proper churches with stained glass windows and marble altars, but there was something about this crude chapel that felt more real, more immediate. The presence of the divine seemed to press down on him like a physical weight, making it difficult to breathe. The chaplain's sermon continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke of sin and redemption, of the flesh as a vessel for suffering, and of the need to purify oneself through pain. The congregation swayed as they listened, their voices joining in the chanting that seemed to come from somewhere deep in their chests. As the sermon reached its crescendo, the chaplain raised the whip above his head. The 9 tails writhed in the air like living things, the metal barbs catching the dim light and throwing it back in sharp flashes. He brought the whip down across his own back with a crack that echoed through the chapel like a gunshot. The congregation gasped as one, their chanting faltering for a moment before resuming with renewed intensity. The chaplain's robe tore where the whip had struck, revealing flesh beneath that was already marked by countless previous lashings. But, as Matthias watched, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The wounds were not merely physical. As the barbs tore through the chaplain's flesh, they seemed to leave behind something more than just torn skin and flowing blood. Dark lines spread out from each wound, like ink being absorbed into parchment. The lines writhed and twisted, forming shapes that looked almost like letters, like words written in some ancient script. The chaplain brought the whip down again and again, each blow adding to the growing tapestry of script that spread across his back. The congregation watched in rapt attention, their chanting growing louder and more urgent. Some of them had begun to weep, tears streaming down their faces as they witnessed what they clearly believed to be a divine revelation. Matthias felt his legs give out beneath him, and he found himself kneeling in the mud, his eyes fixed on the chaplain's back. The script was still moving, still changing, the letters flowing and merging like living things. He could almost make out words, almost understand what was being written, but the meaning remained just beyond his grasp. The whip fell again, and this time, Matthias was certain he heard something other than leather striking flesh. There was a sound like metal on metal, like chains being drawn taut. The script on the chaplain's back pulsed with a light that seemed to come from within, and the wounds began to glow with the same ethereal radiance. The congregation's chanting reached a fever pitch, their voices blending together into a single, overwhelming chorus. Some of them had begun to rock back and forth, their bodies swaying in rhythm with the chaplain's lashings. Others had fallen to their knees, their hands pressed together in prayer, their lips moving in silent supplication. Matthias tried to stand, tried to back away from the chapel, but his body refused to obey. He was trapped, held in place by forces he could not understand, forced to witness whatever was unfolding before him. The script on the chaplain's back continued to grow and change, spreading beyond the torn flesh to cover the entire surface of his robe. The chaplain's voice rose to a shout, his words now clearly audible despite the strange dialect. He spoke of binding, of taking the sins of others into himself, of becoming a living scripture that would guide the faithful through the darkness. The whip fell faster now, each blow accompanied by a flash of light that illuminated the chapel in stark detail. As the final lash struck, the chaplain's voice cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of rain and the heavy breathing of the congregation. The script on his back pulsed once more, then began to fade, the letters sinking back into his flesh like water being absorbed into sand. The wounds closed, leaving only faint scars that looked like old parchment. The chaplain turned to face the congregation, his eyes blazing with an inner light that seemed to burn through the gloom of the trench. His voice, when he spoke, was different now, deeper and more resonant, as if it came from somewhere far away. He spoke of the war, of the endless struggle between faith and heresy, of the need for sacrifice and purification. But his words carried a weight that went beyond mere sermon, beyond simple theology. They seemed to sink into the very bones of his listeners, to take root in their souls and grow there like seeds planted in fertile soil. Matthias felt tears streaming down his face, though he could not say why. The chaplain's words filled him with a mixture of terror and ecstasy, a recognition of truths he had never known he possessed. He wanted to flee, to run screaming from this cursed chapel, but he also wanted to stay, to hear more, to understand what was being revealed to him. The service ended as abruptly as it had begun. The chaplain simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows at the back of the chapel. The congregation sat in stunned silence for a moment, then began to disperse, filing out of the chapel with the slow, measured movements of sleepwalkers. Matthias remained kneeling in the mud long after the last of the congregation had departed. The rain continued to fall, washing away the blood that had pooled around the altar, but he could still feel the weight of what he had witnessed pressing down on him. The script he had seen writhing across the chaplain's back was burned into his memory, the letters dancing behind his eyelids whenever he closed them. He had come here to deliver a message, but he could no longer remember what it was. The parchment in his coat pocket felt heavy and cold, like a stone that had been pulled from the depths of a frozen lake. He reached for it with trembling fingers, but stopped when he saw that his hands were stained with something dark and viscous. The stain spread up his arms, following the lines of his veins like ink spreading through water. He could feel them moving beneath his skin, burrowing deeper with each passing moment. The sensation was not painful, but it was wrong, fundamentally wrong in a way that made his entire body revolt. He staggered to his feet and stumbled out of the chapel, back into the maze of trenches that surrounded St. Agatha's Rest. The rain seemed heavier now, each drop hitting his skin like a small hammer blow. The very air felt thick and oppressive, as if the atmosphere itself had been poisoned by what he had witnessed. As he walked, he became aware of voices echoing through the trenches, Not the normal sounds of soldiers going about their duties, but something else. Whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the mud beneath his feet, from the very air he breathed. They spoke in the same dialect the chaplain had used, words that carried meaning just beyond his understanding. The trenches seemed to stretch on forever, turning and twisting in ways that made no sense. He was certain he had been walking in a straight line, but somehow he kept finding himself back at the same intersections, the same damaged signs, the same shell craters filled with stagnant water. The war had not just consumed the physical landscape, but had somehow infected the very concept of space and direction. He paused at a bend in the trench, leaning against the mud-slicked wall to catch his breath. The stains on his hands had spread further, reaching his wrists now, and he could feel them continuing their inexorable march up his arms. Where they touched, his flesh felt different, harder somehow, as if it were transforming into something else entirely. A sound reached his ears, a soft scratching that seemed to come from inside the trench wall itself. He pressed his ear to the mud and heard it more clearly now, a rhythmic scraping like fingernails on wood. But as he listened, he realized it was not random. There was a pattern to it, a deliberate cadence that reminded him of the chaplain's chanting. The sound was coming from behind the wall, from the earth itself. Something was moving in the darkness, beyond the sandbags and wooden supports, something that knew he was there and was trying to communicate with him. The thought filled him with a terror so profound that he stumbled backward, his boots sliding in the mud. He turned and ran, splashing through puddles and leaping over fallen debris in his haste to escape. But the sound followed him, growing louder and more insistent with each step. It was in the walls now, in the wooden supports, in the very air around him. The entire trench system had become a vast instrument, resonating with a frequency that seemed to vibrate through his bones. The whispers grew louder as he ran, resolving into words he almost recognized. They spoke of binding and sacrifice, of flesh transformed into scripture, of pain as a pathway to divine understanding. The same themes the chaplain had touched upon in his sermon, but presented now with a clarity and urgency that made them impossible to ignore. He burst out of the communication trench and into a wider area, where several units were stationed. Soldiers sat huddled around small fires, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They looked up as he approached, their expressions curious but not alarmed. To them, he was just another runner, another cog in the vast machine of the war. But as he drew closer, he saw that their eyes were wrong. They were too bright, too focused, as if they were looking at something far beyond the physical world. And when they spoke, their voices carried the same resonance he had heard in the chaplain's words, the same weight and depth that seemed to come from somewhere other than their throats. One of them, a sergeant with a face marked by old shrapnel scars, approached him with a concerned expression. He asked if Matthias was all right, if he needed medical attention, but his words carried an undercurrent of something else. There was an eagerness in his voice, a hunger that made Matthias's skin crawl. He backed away from the sergeant, his hands raised in a gesture of denial. The stains on his arms had spread further, reaching his elbows now, and he could feel them pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The sergeant's eyes fixed on the stains, and his expression changed from concern to something approaching reverence. The other soldiers began to gather around, their movements slow and deliberate. They formed a circle around Matthias, their faces all bearing the same expression of hungry anticipation. One of them began to chant, the same low, rhythmic drone he had heard in the chapel. The others joined in, their voices blending together into a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Matthias tried to run, but his legs would not obey. The stains on his arms had reached his shoulders now, and he could feel them spreading across his chest, following the lines of his ribs like fingers, exploring a familiar landscape. Where they touched, his flesh felt numb and cold, as if it were no longer entirely his own. The chanting grew louder, more insistent. The soldiers began to move closer, their hands reaching out to touch him, to trace the patterns of the spreading stains. Their fingers left trails of warmth on his skin, but it was a warmth that felt wrong, invasive, like the touch of something that should not exist. He opened his mouth to scream, but the sound that emerged was not his own voice. It was deeper, more resonant, carrying the same weight and power he had heard in the chaplain's words. The soldiers stopped their advance, their faces lighting up with joy and wonder. They had found what they were looking for, what they had been waiting for. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of his former self. The stains had covered his entire body now, transforming his flesh into something that resembled old parchment. He could feel the script beginning to form beneath his skin, the same writhing letters he had seen on the chaplain's back. But these were different, more complex, more complete. The soldiers knelt in the mud around him, their voices raised in praise and thanksgiving. They had witnessed a miracle, a transformation that confirmed everything they had been taught about the nature of faith and sacrifice. He was no longer Matthias, no longer a simple communications runner. He had become something else, something that would guide them through the darkness of the war. The transformation was complete, but it was only the beginning. The script beneath his skin pulsed with a light that seemed to come from within, and he could feel knowledge flowing through him like water through a broken dam. He understood now what the chaplain had been trying to accomplish, what the war itself was truly about. It was not about territory or resources, not about the political machinations of distant kings and emperors. It was about transformation, about the gradual conversion of flesh into something greater, something that could serve as a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the divine. The war was not destroying humanity, it was evolving it, shaping it into something that could survive the coming darkness. The soldiers waited for him to speak, to share with them the knowledge that had been written into his very being. But the words that formed in his throat were not words at all, but something else entirely. They were shapes and sounds that existed beyond language, beyond the limited understanding of mortal minds. They were the beginning of a new form of communication, a new way of sharing truth that did not rely on the crude tools of speech and writing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the entire trench system, echoing through the tunnels and chambers like the voice of the earth itself. The soldiers who heard it fell to their knees, their faces streaming with tears of joy and recognition. They had heard the voice of their God, and it had spoken through one of their own. The message spread from trench to trench, carried by runners and signalmen who had been forever changed by what they had witnessed. The chaplain's work was bearing fruit. The seeds of transformation that had been planted in the minds of the faithful were beginning to sprout. The war was entering a new phase, one that would see the very nature of humanity itself called into question. In the days that followed, more soldiers began to show signs of the transformation. The stains appeared on their hands and arms, spreading slowly but inexorably across their flesh. They welcomed the change, embracing it as a sign of divine favor, proof that they had been chosen for a higher purpose. The chaplains and priests who ministered to them spoke of it as a blessing, a mark of purity that would guide them through the trials ahead. But there were others who saw the transformation for what it truly was. Officers and medics who had not yet been touched by the spreading influence recognized the signs of something far more sinister than divine blessing. They tried to quarantine the affected soldiers, to study the phenomenon and find a way to reverse it, but their efforts were doomed from the start. The transformation was not a disease that could be cured or contained. It was a fundamental change in the nature of reality itself, a rewriting of the basic laws that governed flesh and spirit. Those who had been touched by it were no longer entirely human, and those who had not were becoming increasingly irrelevant to the greater design that was unfolding. The war continued, but it was no longer the same war that had begun 8 centuries ago. The trenches themselves were changing, evolving into something that resembled a vast organism more than a military fortification. The walls pulsed with a life of their own, and the mud beneath the soldiers' feet felt warm and responsive, as if it were aware of their presence. The weapons they carried began to change as well. Rifles and bayonets were transformed into instruments of ritual and ceremony, their original purpose forgotten in favor of something far more profound. The bullets they fired were no longer simple pieces of metal, but carriers of divine will, each one inscribed with microscopic script that would continue the work of transformation even after the battle had ended. The enemy forces across no man's land were experiencing similar changes. The war was no longer between opposing armies, but between different interpretations of the same fundamental truth. They were all part of the same great work, all playing their assigned roles in the cosmic drama that was unfolding across the battlefield. As the transformation spread, the very concept of victory and defeat began to lose meaning. The war was not meant to be won or lost, but to continue forever, each battle serving as a ritual that would bring humanity closer to its ultimate destiny. The soldiers who fought and died were not casualties, but willing participants in a ceremony that spanned centuries. The chaplain continued his work, moving from trench to trench, spreading the word of the transformation and preparing new converts for the change that awaited them. His whip had evolved as well, the 9 tails now clearly visible as living things, each one inscribed with script that pulsed with its own inner light. When he used it, the pain it inflicted was not merely physical, but spiritual, a burning away of all that was unnecessary and impure. The congregation that gathered to hear his sermons grew larger with each passing day. Soldiers abandoned their posts to follow him, driven by a compulsion they could not understand but could not resist. They carried the word to other units, to other sectors of the front, spreading the influence of the transformation like a virus that infected not the body, but the soul. The high command tried to intervene, to reassert control over the situation before it spiraled completely out of hand. They issued orders and threats, deployed military police, and special units trained in dealing with religious extremism, but their efforts were futile, like trying to stop the tide with a handful of sand. The transformation had reached a critical mass, a point beyond which it could no longer be contained or reversed. The war itself had become a living thing, feeding on the faith and devotion of those who fought in it, growing stronger with each passing moment. The original conflict between the forces of heaven and hell had evolved into something far more complex and terrifying. The script that had begun on the chaplain's back was now written across the entire battlefield, carved into the landscape itself by the passage of countless boots and the explosion of countless shells. The trenches formed letters, the craters spelled out words, and the movements of the armies traced sentences across the scarred earth. The war had become a book, and humanity was both its author and its ink. Those who could still read the old language, who had not yet been touched by the transformation, struggled to understand what was being written. The words were familiar, drawn from ancient texts and holy scriptures, but their meaning had been twisted and corrupted by the influence of the war. They spoke of sacrifice and redemption, but in terms that made a mockery of everything that had once been held sacred. The transformation was accelerating now, spreading beyond the confines of the battlefield to touch the civilian populations in the rear areas. Factory workers who manufactured weapons and supplies found their hands marked with the same stains that had first appeared on the soldiers. Priests and ministers who had blessed the troops before they departed for the front began to speak in the same resonant tones that had marked the chaplain's sermons. The change was not limited to humans alone. The very landscape was being transformed, the earth itself becoming something alien and hostile. Trees grew in twisted spirals, their branches forming shapes that resembled the script that had been carved into human flesh. Rivers ran backward, their waters carrying messages that could only be read by those who had been touched by the transformation. The sky itself was changing, the clouds forming patterns that mirrored the movements of the armies below. The sun seemed dimmer, its light filtered through a haze that carried the scent of burning flesh and rusted metal. The moon, when it appeared, was the color of dried blood, its surface marked with shadows that looked disturbingly like the faces of the war dead. Time itself began to behave strangely in the areas touched by the transformation. Soldiers would find themselves reliving the same battle over and over again, each iteration slightly different from the last. The dead would rise from their graves, not as zombies or revenants, but as participants in a ritual that had no beginning and no end. The war was consuming not just the present, but the past and future as well, incorporating all of history into its grand design. The chaplain's sermons grew more frequent and more elaborate, his words carrying across vast distances without the aid of any mechanical device. He spoke of the final revelation, the moment when the transformation would be complete and humanity would be ready to take its place in the cosmic order. The war was not a tragedy, but a necessary step in the evolution of consciousness itself. His congregation now numbered in the thousands, soldiers and civilians alike, drawn by the promise of transcendence that his words offered. They gathered in vast amphitheaters carved into the earth itself, their voices raised in chants that seemed to make the very ground tremble. The script that covered their bodies pulsed in unison, creating patterns of light that could be seen from miles away. The whip in the chaplain's hand had grown as well, the nine tails now clearly visible as serpentine creatures with minds of their own. They moved independently, seeking out new converts among the congregation, touching them with barbs that left not wounds, but blessings. Each touch added to the great work, furthering the transformation that would remake the world. The enemy forces across no man's land had begun to mirror the changes taking place in the Allied trenches. Their own chaplains and holy men spoke of similar revelations, of transformations that would elevate their followers to a higher state of being. The war was no longer about opposing ideologies, but about competing visions of what humanity could become. Battles were fought not for strategic advantage, but for the right to shape the final form of the transformation. Each victory added to the winning side's influence over the great work. Each defeat was simply another step in the cosmic dance that was unfolding across the battlefield. The casualties were not losses, but contributions to a cause that transcended individual existence. The script that had been carved into the landscape was beginning to take on a life of its own. Words would rearrange themselves overnight. Sentences would shift and change to reflect the evolving nature of the conflict. The earth itself had become a living document, constantly being rewritten by the actions of those who walked upon it. Those who tried to flee the influence of the transformation found that escape was impossible. The change had spread too far, infected too many minds, to be contained by physical barriers. The roads that led away from the battlefield curved back upon themselves, forming loops that would eventually bring travelers back to where they had started. The war had become a gravity well, drawing everything into its influence. The chaplain's final sermon was delivered from the heart of no man's land, in a crater that had been formed by the explosion of a shell containing not explosive, but concentrated essence of the transformation itself. The congregation that gathered to hear him speak numbered in the hundreds of thousands, soldiers and civilians from both sides of the conflict, united in their desire to witness the culmination of the great work. His words, when he spoke them, were not heard so much as felt, vibrating through the bones and souls of all who were present. He spoke of the moment of completion, when the transformation would be finalized and the new form of humanity would emerge from the crucible of war. The script that covered his body blazed with light, and the 9 tails of his whip writhed like living flames. The congregation responded with a sound that was part chant, part scream, part prayer. Their voices merged into a single, overwhelming roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. The script that covered their bodies pulsed in perfect synchronization, creating a pattern of light that could be seen from orbit if anyone had been left to observe it. The transformation reached its climax as the chaplain raised his whip for the final time. The 9 tails uncoiled, stretching out across the battlefield like the fingers of some vast, invisible hand. They touched every member of the congregation, every soldier in every trench, every civilian in every town and city. The touch was not painful, but it was final, sealing the fate of humanity forever. The war did not end with the completion of the transformation. Instead, it became eternal, a permanent state of being that would define the new form of humanity for all time. The soldiers who had once fought for king and country now fought for concepts that could not be expressed in any human language. The weapons they carried were no longer instruments of destruction, but tools of creation, each shot fired, adding to the great work that was being written across the cosmos. The chaplain himself was transformed beyond recognition, his human form dissolving into something that was part flesh, part scripture, part living flame. He became one with the battlefield. His consciousness spread across every trench and crater, every blade of grass and grain of sand. The war had consumed him completely, but in doing so, it had also elevated him to a state of being that transcended individual existence. The script that had been carved into the landscape began to move, the words flowing like water across the scarred earth. They told a story that had no beginning and no end. a tale of transformation and transcendence that would continue to unfold for eternity. The war had become a living book, and humanity had become its alphabet. Those who had resisted the transformation found themselves gradually absorbed into the great work despite their efforts to remain separate. The change was not forced upon them, but offered as a gift, a chance to participate in something far greater than individual existence. Most accepted willingly, recognizing the futility of resistance. Those who continued to refuse simply faded away, their consciousness gradually erased by the weight of the transformation. The new form of humanity that emerged from the war was something that could not have been imagined by those who had lived before. They were beings of pure purpose, their every thought and action directed toward the continuation of the great work. The war was not a burden to be endured, but a joy to be celebrated, an eternal dance of creation and destruction that would continue until the end of time itself. The chaplain's whip had become something more than a weapon or a tool. It was a symbol of the transformation, a reminder of the price that had been paid and the rewards that had been gained. The 9 tails writhed with a life of their own, each one inscribed with script that told a different part of the story. They were the authors of the new world, the scribes who would continue to write the tale of humanity's evolution. The war spread beyond the confines of Earth, carried by the transformed consciousness of humanity to distant stars and alien worlds. Each new battlefield became another page in the great book, each new conflict another chapter in the eternal story. The transformation was not limited to a single species or a single world, but was a universal process that would eventually encompass all of creation. The script that had been carved into human flesh was now written across the fabric of space and time itself. The movements of galaxies traced out words in a language that could only be read by those who had been touched by the transformation. The birth and death of stars spelled out sentences that described the ongoing work of creation and destruction. The universe itself had become a living document, constantly being rewritten by the actions of its inhabitants. The chaplain's consciousness spread across the infinite expanse of the transformed reality, continued to guide the great work with wisdom gained through countless eons of experience. He was no longer a single individual, but a collective intelligence that embodied the will of the transformation itself. His sermons were no longer delivered to congregations of soldiers, but to entire civilizations, entire species, entire galaxies. The war was eternal, and the transformation was complete. Humanity had found its true purpose, its ultimate destiny, in the endless dance of creation and destruction that defined the new reality. The script that had been written in flesh and blood had become the fundamental law of existence, the governing principle that would guide the universe through all the ages to come. The 9 tails of the chaplain's whip reached out across the cosmos, touching every world, every star, every particle of matter and energy. They were the instruments of the transformation, the tools by which the great work would continue to unfold. Each touch left its mark, adding to the ever-growing body of script that defined the new reality. The war had become the universe, and the universe had become the war. There was no longer any distinction between the two, no longer any concept of before or after. The transformation was complete, eternal, and irreversible. The great work would continue forever, each moment adding to the infinite story being written across the cosmos. But in the deepest trenches, where the transformed flesh pressed against ancient stone, something older stirred. The script that flowed across the battlefield encountered resistance, words that had been carved into the earth long before the first shell had fallen. The original language, the true language, the words that had been spoken in the beginning when the world was young and the war was merely a distant possibility. The chaplain's consciousness, spread across the infinite expanse of reality, felt the disturbance like a splinter in the mind of God. The 9 tails of his whip recoiled, their barbs scraping against something that would not yield, something that remembered what had been before the transformation began. The script that covered his ethereal form flickered and wavered, the letters losing their coherence for the first time in eons. In Trench Gamma 7, where it had all begun, the mud began to bubble and churn. The wooden duckboards that had rotted through centuries of war cracked and split, revealing chambers beneath that had never been mapped, never been explored. The air that rose from these depths carried the scent of something that was not quite decay, not quite life, but something that existed in the spaces between the two. The soldiers who had been transformed, who had become living scripture in service to the great work, found themselves drawn to these emerging spaces. They walked with the measured pace of sleepwalkers, their flesh pulsing with script that grew dimmer with each step. The words that had been carved into their bodies began to fade, replaced by something older, something that spoke in a language that predated human speech. The chaplain's voice, which had echoed across the cosmos for so long, began to falter. The words that had flowed from his transformed throat like water from a broken dam slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. The silence that followed was not empty, but pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of things that had been forgotten but never truly lost. In the depths of the earth, in chambers that had been sealed since the world was young, ancient machinery began to turn. Gears made of stone and bone ground against each other with a sound like the grinding of teeth. The walls were carved with script that looked familiar but read differently, words that spoke of endings rather than beginnings, of silence rather than song. The transformed soldiers descended into these depths, their footsteps echoing in chambers that had never known human presence. The script on their bodies continued to fade, the letters dissolving like salt in water. But they did not resist the change, did not mourn the loss of their divine purpose. They walked with the acceptance of those who had finally remembered what they had forgotten. The 9 tails of the chaplain's whip writhed in confusion, their barbs striking against stone that would not yield, flesh that would not transform. The great work was unraveling, the cosmic script was being erased, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The war that had consumed reality itself was being consumed in turn by something older, something that had been waiting patiently for this moment. The chambers beneath the battlefield were vast beyond comprehension, stretching away into darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. The soldiers who had descended into these depths spread out across the stone floor, their transformed flesh gradually returning to its original state. The script that had defined their existence for so long faded to nothing, leaving only the memory of what they had been. But the memory was not their own. It belonged to the chambers, to the stone, to the ancient machinery that continued to turn in the depths. The war that had raged above had been nothing more than a distraction, a way to keep the transformed consciousness occupied while the true work continued below. The chaplain's sermons had been echoes of words that had been spoken in these depths long before humanity had learned to speak. The original language, the true language, began to reassert itself. The The words that had been carved into the stone were not commands or instructions, but a record of what had been, what was, and what would be. The war was not eternal, as the chaplain had claimed, but cyclical, part of a greater pattern that repeated itself across eons of time. The transformed soldiers stood in the vast chambers, their flesh once again merely flesh, their minds once again merely minds, but they were not free. They had become something else, something that existed between the moments of the cycle, guardians of a truth that could not be spoken in any language that the living could understand. The chaplain's consciousness, no longer spread across the cosmos but contracted to a single point of awareness, found itself drawn into the depths as well. The 9 tails of his whip had withered and died, their barbs falling to the stone floor with sounds like rain. He walked through the chambers as he had once walked through the trenches, but now he was not the teacher, but the student, not the shepherd, but the sheep. The machinery in the depths continued to turn, its purpose becoming clear as the cycle reached its completion. The war that had consumed reality was being rewound. The transformation that had changed the nature of existence was being undone. But this was not salvation, not redemption, not the restoration of what had been lost. It was simply the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The script that had been carved into the stone began to glow with a light that was not light, a radiance that existed in spectrums beyond human perception. The words spoke of other wars, other transformations, other realities that had been consumed and recreated in an endless cycle of birth and death. The war that had seemed so important, so final, was merely one note in a symphony that had no beginning and no end. The chaplain reached the heart of the chambers, where the machinery was largest and most complex. Here, carved into the stone, was the source of the original language, the words that had been spoken when the cycle began. But they were not words of power or command, not instructions for the transformation of reality. They were a simple statement, a recognition of what was and what always would be. The statement was this: the war is not the war. The transformation is not the transformation. The great work is not the great work. All that has been done before, and all that will be done again. The cycle continues, and the cycle is eternal. The machinery reached its final configuration, the gears locking into place with a sound like the closing of a great door. The war above ground ceased, not with victory or defeat, but with the simple recognition that it had served its purpose. The transformed soldiers in the depths stood motionless, their eyes reflecting the light of the glowing script, their minds touched by knowledge that they could never fully comprehend. The chaplain stood before the stone tablet, his flesh no longer marked by the script of transformation but by something older, something that had been waiting for this moment since the beginning of time. The 9 tails of his whip had been replaced by something else, something that existed in the spaces between reality, something that could touch the cycle itself. He raised his hand to the stone, and the original language flowed through him like water through a broken dam. But these were not words of creation or destruction, not commands or instructions. They were simply the truth, the recognition of what had always been and what would always be. The war was not eternal, but the cycle was. The transformation was not final, but the pattern was. The great work was not complete, but the repetition was. The machinery began to turn in reverse, the gears grinding against each other with a sound like the world ending. The chambers filled with light that was not light, sound that was not sound, presence that was not presence. The cycle was completing itself, preparing for the next iteration, the next war, the next transformation. The soldiers in the depths began to move, but not with the purpose that had driven them in the war above. They moved with the certainty of those who knew their role in the greater pattern, who understood that their individual existence was merely a single thread in a tapestry that stretched across eternity. They were not soldiers anymore, but something else, something that existed between the moments of the cycle. The chaplain's voice, when it came, was not his own but the voice of the cycle itself, speaking words in the original language that had been carved into the stone. He spoke of the next war, the next transformation, the next great work that would consume reality and remake it in its own image. But he also spoke of the pattern, the eternal repetition, the recognition that all things were connected in ways that transcended individual understanding. The light in the chambers began to fade, the machinery slowing to a stop. The cycle was complete, and the cycle was beginning again. The war above ground was ending, but somewhere else, in another reality, another time, another place. The first shots were being fired in a conflict that would consume everything and transform it into something new. The script on the stone began to change, the words rearranging themselves to reflect the new iteration of the cycle. The soldiers in the depths watched with eyes that reflected the changing light, their minds touched by knowledge that they could never fully comprehend but could never forget. They were guardians of the pattern, keepers of the cycle, witnesses to the eternal repetition that defined all existence. The chaplain turned away from the stone, his purpose fulfilled but never complete. The cycle would continue, and he would be there to guide it, to ensure that the pattern was maintained, that the repetition continued. The war was not eternal, but his role in it was. The transformation was not final, but his participation in it was. The great work was not complete, but his contribution to it was. The chambers began to empty, the soldiers dispersing into the darkness that surrounded the machinery. They would wait in the spaces between the cycles, ready to play their roles when the next iteration began. The war was ending, but the war was always beginning somewhere else, in another time, another place, another reality. The machinery came to a complete stop, the gears locking into their final position. The light in the chambers faded to nothing, leaving only the darkness that had existed before the cycle began. But it was not empty darkness, not void or nothingness. It was pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of what would come next. The chaplain stood alone in the darkness, his flesh marked by script that flickered and wavered like candlelight in a wind. The words spoke of endings and beginnings, of cycles within cycles, of patterns that repeated themselves across dimensions that had no names. He was no longer entirely human, but he was not entirely other. He existed in the spaces between, a guardian of the pattern, a keeper of the cycle. The silence in the chambers was not empty but full, pregnant with the sound of machinery that was not yet turning, voices that were not yet speaking, wars that were not yet being fought. The cycle was complete, and the cycle was eternal. The war was ending, and the war was always beginning. In the darkness, the chaplain's eyes glowed with the light of the original language, the words that had been carved into the stone when the world was young and the cycle was new. He would wait in the spaces between the iterations, ready to guide the next transformation, ready to ensure that the pattern continued. The war was not eternal, but the cycle was. The transformation was not final, but the repetition was. The chambers fell silent, the machinery still, the soldiers dispersed into the darkness. But the pattern remained, waiting for the next iteration, the next war, the next transformation. The cycle was complete, and the cycle was eternal. The war was ending, and the war was always beginning. The original language pulsed once more through the stone, a final recognition of what had been accomplished and what would be accomplished again. The chaplain felt the words flow through him, like water through a broken dam, carrying knowledge that he could never fully comprehend, but could never forget. He was part of the pattern now, part of the cycle, part of the eternal repetition that defined all existence. The darkness in the chambers was complete, but it was not empty. It was full of potential, heavy with the weight of what would come next. The war was ending, but the war was always beginning. The transformation was complete, but the transformation was eternal. The great work was finished, but the great work was never done. In the silence, in the darkness, in the spaces between the cycles, the chaplain waited. The pattern would continue, the cycle would repeat, the war would begin again. He would be there to guide it, to ensure that the repetition continued, that the eternal dance of creation and destruction played on forever. The machinery in the depths began to turn once more, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The next iteration was beginning, the next war was starting, the next transformation was taking shape. The cycle was complete, and the cycle was eternal. The war was ending, and the war was always beginning. The chaplain smiled in the darkness, his flesh marked by script that told the story of all wars, all transformations, all great works that had been and would be. He was no longer merely human, but he was not entirely other. He existed in the spaces between, a guardian of the pattern, a keeper of the cycle, a witness to the eternal repetition that defined all existence. The war was ending, but the war was always beginning. The transformation was complete, but the transformation was eternal. The great work was finished, but the great work was never done. The cycle continued, and the cycle was eternal. The pattern repeated, and the pattern was infinite. In the darkness, in the silence, in the spaces between the cycles, the chaplain waited. The next iteration was beginning, and he would be there to guide it. The war was ending, and the war was always beginning. The cycle was complete, and the cycle was eternal. End of script moment, adding to the infinite story being written across the cosmos. The chaplain's final words, spoken not with a human voice, but with the voice of reality itself, echoed through the transformed universe. The scripture is written, the flesh is willing, and the war is eternal. Let the great work continue, world without end. The 9 tails of his whip writhed with approval, their barbs glittering with the light of 1,000,000,000,000 transformed stars. The war was complete, and the war was just beginning. The transformation had succeeded beyond all measure, and the price had been everything that had once been human. In the end, there was only the script, only the war, only the endless dance of creation and destruction that defined the new reality. The chaplain's work was done, and the chaplain's work would never end. The 9 tails of his whip reached out across infinity, seeking new worlds to transform, new realities to consume, new stories to write in the flesh of the cosmos. The war was eternal, and the transformation was complete. The great work would continue forever, each moment adding to the infinite story being written across the fabric of existence itself. The script that had been carved into human flesh had become the fundamental law of the universe, the governing principle that would guide all of creation through the ages to come. The chaplain's whip cracked one final time, the sound echoing through the transformed cosmos like the voice of God himself. The 9 tails writhed with pleasure, their work complete but never ending. The war was eternal, and the transformation was forever. The script continued to flow across the battlefield, across the world, across the universe, spelling out words in a language that transcended human understanding. The great work was complete, and the great work had just begun. The war was eternal, and the transformation was absolute. In the depths of the trenches, in the heart of the cosmos, in the very fabric of reality itself, the chaplain's voice continued to echo, speaking words of transformation and transcendence that would guide the universe through all the ages to come. The war was eternal, and the war was divine. The 9 tails of his whip reached out across the infinite expanse of the transformed reality, touching every world, every star, every particle of matter and energy. They were the instruments of the transformation, the tools by which the great work would continue to unfold. Each touch left its mark, adding to the ever-growing body of script that defined the new reality.